Hello there, and welcome to the Fish Tank Barn. A few weeks ago, I was going through some old pictures. It really got me thinking about all the people, places, and events that really formed my aquarium hobby and really helped create the building that you see behind me. So let's go ahead and dive into the early part of my hobby and explore the people, places, and events that made the Fish Tank Barn. The story of the Fish Tank Barn really begins at the beginning of my aquarium hobby. Since I was a kid, I'd been dabbling in and out of fish tanks throughout my childhood, having various levels of success. One of the things that I was always interested in was saltwater aquariums. I even tried keeping a saltwater aquarium back in the 1980s, which was quite a challenge. It didn't go very well, since at that time you didn't have the internet and there wasn't the knowledge of the reef keeping practices that we know now. As I grew up, I did continue to keep aquariums on and off into adulthood, with varying levels of success. Pretty much like your average person keeping fish tanks. The early part of my working career really saw the beginning of my deeper dive into the aquarium hobby. I was in a period of not keeping aquariums when I met a couple of friends from work who were really into fish keeping. This re-sparked my interest, and I ended up going into it a little bit more hardcore than I had before. This is when I purchased my first large tank. This was a 90-gallon tank that turned into a fish-only with live rock saltwater tank that I kept for some time. I don't remember exactly how long this tank had been set up, but it had been set up for quite a while. And then I started dating my wife, and at that point, my aquarium hobby decided to wane again because I got involved in other things. We eventually got married, and the tank sat dormant in the basement for some time. I eventually got the itch to set that tank up again, and that was really what sparked the real beginning of the fish barn and my aquarium hobby. I would say that this was about 2006 or 2007, and at this point, the internet had become widely used. So it was a lot easier to do research and learn a lot of different things. This is when I started going onto the saltwater forums to learn as much as I could before setting up this tank again. And this was really where I learned a lot about the nitrogen cycle, reef chemistry, and basically the basics of fish keeping. And with the knowledge I gained from the forums, this 90-gallon became a lot more successful. This 90-gallon eventually morphed into a 180-gallon reef tank, which you've seen me talk about from time to time on my live streams with James from Fishroom Fever and Chattanooga Ed. In the process of setting up this 180-gallon tank, I started to learn about a local reef club, the Marine Aquarium Society of Michigan, which was located in my area. I eventually went to my first meeting and really got hooked on the aquarium hobby for good. At the aquarium club, I was able to learn a lot of really good things. I remember my first meeting, we actually were able to drill glass. So someone had an auto body shop, and someone was able to procure some scrap glass, and we all got to learn how to drill glass correctly. That was something I ended up using quite a bit here in the fish barn and all along in my aquarium hobby. My experiences at the aquarium club really opened my eyes to a lot of different things. We used to hold an annual saltwater convention that included a frag swap, as well as speakers that we flew in from all over the country. One of my favorite memories was picking up these speakers from the airport. I owned a minivan at the time, so I usually got tasked with this duty. It was pretty interesting hearing all the conversations from the speakers as we drove to the hotel. I also went to my first big aquarium convention, which was MACNA 2009 in Orlando, Florida. I really got to meet a ton of interesting people and really got to learn a lot. I would spend all day in the talks, soaking up information and learning as much as I could. At night, I would hang out with various people and really engage in some really great aquarium-related conversations. If you're into saltwater fish keeping, I would highly recommend attending a MACNA. I went to MACNA for quite a few years and really learned a lot about fish keeping in my experience there. Through the fish club, I was also introduced to clownfish breeding as well as the concept of fishrooms, which was something pretty rare when you talk about the saltwater side of the hobby. Most of the time, a fish room in saltwater is something that's considered a place to hold your equipment. We had a member of our club named Tal who had really gotten into clownfish breeding and had set up his own fish room to breed clownfish. I remember having a club meeting to tour his fish room, and I remember leaving saying, I'm never going to do something like that. Well, we kind of know how that turned out, didn't we? Tal eventually ended up starting something called the Marine Breeding Initiative, or MBI. The MBI was a Saltwater Breeders Award program an annual conference that eventually replaced the reef conference we used to hold. The Breeders' Award program from the MBI was what led me to build my first fish room in the basement of our old house. This fish room primarily held numerous breeding pairs of clownfish and went through many twists and turns. But I was eventually able to raise some Ocellaris clownfish as well as spawn a few other saltwater species. Another interesting thing from the MBI was that there was an individual who had joined from the Pacific Northwest who had built his own saltwater breeding room in an outbuilding in his house. This was affectionately known as the Clown House, where he bred numerous species of clownfish. During this time, both of our daughters were born, and we had ended up working about 45 minutes to an hour away from home. So with young children, that was not necessarily ideal. So we decided we needed to move, and we found this property on Facebook, and we ended up purchasing this property with the barn in the backyard. As part of this move, I did end up having a fish room in the basement for the current species of fish that I did have. But unfortunately, I did have two larger tanks that I didn't set up till much later. This basement fish room stayed in various iterations for about a year and a half or so when I got ideas about that building out back. However, there were a few limitations with the building out back. First of all, there was no running water out back, and secondly, there was no heat. And being in Michigan, you definitely need to have some heat in order to have a fish room outside. So I went ahead and put a post on the MBI stating that I was thinking about doing something with the barn and asking for suggestions on how to heat the space. Someone had posted that I could use something called the pellet heater, so I dove headfirst into building my first version of the fish tank barn. This first version of the fish tank barn was pretty basic. It had some rows of 20-gallon tanks on the bottom floor of the fish barn. There were no tanks on the top, that was just storage. It had the pellet heater and a 55-gallon drum that I used to hold top-off water. This 55-gallon drum was filled from a hose that I took from the house to fill up the drum. Since they were breeding stock, I didn't need to worry about having RO water. To make a long story short, the pellet heater failed, in my opinion, due to all the humidity in the fish barn, and I had to do an emergency fish rescue mission one February Friday in order to get the fish to warmer waters that were still in the basement. At this point, I had abandoned the idea of having a fish barn until I could have running water and a reliable heat source, as well as two ways to compensate for anything that I could come up with that could fail. I eventually reset up the fish room in the basement, and after a few years, I really got into watching YouTube, and I started stumbling upon aquarium channels like the Aquarium Co-op and Corvus Oskin. To correspond with this, I was getting kind of bored with trying to breed clownfish, so I decided to go with more of a 50-50 split between freshwater and saltwater. You can see much of this in the first fish room tour video I did back in March of 2018. During this time, Corvus Oskin was building his fish room and was documenting the process on YouTube. Those videos really got me to start thinking about building the fish barn again. So after watching all of Joel's videos of his fish room build, as well as doing some research on my own, I decided to go ahead and start making some plans to maybe bring fish back out to the fish barn once again. In the middle of this process, I was fortunate enough to both meet Corey and Joel at the ALA convention in 2018 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And this really introduced me to the freshwater side of the hobby, as well as to the YouTube community as well. And let's just say, the rest is history. I really had a lot of fun going through all of my old pictures. Really brought back a lot of memories. There were a lot of things that really came together to make my hobby what it is today. Things like the Clown House, Tal's Fish Room, the MBI, and the fish clubs I was a part of were really instrumental in making my hobby what it's become today. So I hope you enjoyed taking this trip down memory lane with me. And with that being said, stay safe, stay fishy, and I'll catch you on the next video.